Hello, friends. This is a reading from Philosophy as a Way of Life by Pierre Hadot, a French philosopher and historian of philosophy. I've come across this book in my own studies into Hellenistic myth, pagan religion, roots of Christianity. Kind of jumping around a little bit here. I'm kind of starting after I've already begun. And so I want to capture some of the key kind of concepts that I think are resonating with me relating to Hadot's writing. This is a book translated, and the introduction is by Arnold I. Davidson, who I am not familiar with. I will dig a little deeper into that, but it was a recommended book online on some group that I was having a discussion. So Hadot's kind of main points are, bottom line, philosophy is lived, and these works, especially, the way they were taught through dialogues, through verbal discussions and arguments, and they reached kind of conclusions together, and the student or disciple would kind of take themselves through that process. And I think that is very much in line with my personal experience, maybe say deepening of my own kind of exploration of myself and learning to orient myself to myself. And so I'm going to do some readings here. Hadot's methodology was very rigorous. He was known for it. And he basically translated the original text to French. And this translation is from his French. And so there's a lot of quotes from original authors, and so that is handled by the author. The translator has translated the French version of Hadot's interpretations of the original text, and often, he has very unique and original perspectives, and they often differ from the experts. And I'm only taking that from the author's introduction. I don't know. I have not studied in depth myself those sources, so I am speaking secondhand here, and just kind of relaying what I'm finding in the book. So I think there's a lot of wisdom already I can see in his approach. He basically says there's a lot of creative misinterpretations throughout history, and you have to be careful that, like looking at the way that the word being is originally maybe been meant by Plato, and now how it's being, over time, it's an infinitive, has become a participle, and, that fundamentally can change the meaning of a word. And whole branches of philosophy apparently have branched off from these kinds of creative misunderstandings or misinterpretations. And so he does a lot of writing to correct some of those. He wrote quite a bit extensively on that, and I'm really just getting into him. So I am not speaking authoritatively at all about his life or his writings, so forgive me if I mischaracterize anything. I'm kind of just going from memory from the introduction. But I kind of started with his chapter on Socrates, the figure of Socrates, and it just kind of correlated with some of my own studies, Zen studies or Zen practice, because I've really been trying to integrate Stoic spiritual exercises into my life, and not just meditations on writings, but actually practicing through word, discussion with other people, through writing, through art, through failure, through a lot of failure, analyzing my reactions and the causes of my actions, and so. I was really intrigued to see there's another book I have that I've been reading a little bit of, The Inner Citadel, also by Pierre Hadot, and I really like his writing. I like his approach. He's noted and well known for being a very detailed and methodical researcher and historian. So, he has a holistic view, which I think is always the best way. You have to kind of put yourself in the environment of the original author. And, with Socrates, right, we don't have any writings from Socrates. We just have Plato's dialogues and writings, which are secondhand. So he says, those are filters of filters. You have the original language filtered, maybe translated into another language, which is then maybe translated into another language later. And so that tends to introduce errors, just like copying genes. And I suppose it's an evolutionary process with language. And so, I want to capture some of these readings that I had today, which I thought made some very interesting points. And I thought he characterized and summarized Stoicism really better than I've really ever heard anybody or read anybody really write. And so, and he also got into, one of my favorites, Nietzsche, recent favorites, Nietzsche, and his reactions to Socrates. And let me start there. This is, basically Hadot feels that trying to understand Nietzsche's anger at Socrates and his death and how he faced his death. Nietzsche accused Socrates of being basically suffering life, not being the rogue and the lover of life and Dionysian that he presented himself as. And that's really what captured Plato's imagination, I think, about Socrates. Plato had a love of his teacher who had a love of life. And he followed Socrates because he did love life and he found meaning in it. And the meaning is in our moral application of our own ethic, and our own choices that we make. Because what Hadot writes very clearly about is that, Eros, who Socrates represented, was Eros, which was a neutral force. And basically represented the inner diamond that Socrates talked about. And Socrates was more of a roguish sage. He was known as a prodigious drinker. He could drink anybody, hold his wine better than anybody. And I find him a very fascinating guy. So this is on page 163. Just like the ironical Socrates, Eros teaches nothing, for he is ignorant. He does not make people more wise. He makes them other. He too is maieutic. He helps souls to engender themselves. It is touching to trace the influence of Socratic Eros throughout history. In 3rd century Alexandria, for instance, the Christian writer Gregory Thaumaturgus praised the master Origen in the following terms: "And thus, like some spark lighting upon our inmost soul, love was kindled and burst into flame within us, a love at once for the Logos, and for this man, its friend and advocate. Sometimes he would approach us in the genuine Socratic fashion and trip us up by his argumentation whenever he saw us getting restive under him, like so many unbroken horses." As Bertram has shown in some splendid pages, we encounter the tradition of Socratic Eros and the educative diamond in Nietzsche. According to Bertram, 3 sayings sum up perfectly the erotic dimension of pedagogy. One is by Nietzsche himself: "The deepest insights spring from love alone." Another is by Goethe: "We learn only from those we love." Finally, there is Holderlin's dictum: "Mortal man gives his best when he loves." These three maxims go to show that it is only through reciprocal love that we can accede to genuine consciousness. So using Goethe's terminology, we could characterize this dimension of love, desire, and the irrational as the demonic. Plato had encountered this dimension in the person of Socrates himself, as well as known Socrates' daimon was a kind of inspiration which sometimes came over him in a completely irrational way, as a negative sign telling him not to do such and such a thing. It was, in a sense, his real character or true self. Moreover, this irrational element in Socratic consciousness is probably not without relation to Socratic irony. It is possible that Socrates' reason for asserting that he did not know anything was that when it came time for action, he trusted in his own daimon, as he also trusted in the daimon of his interlocutors. In any case, as James Hillman pointed out in 1966, if Plato was able to bestow upon Socrates the figure of the great daimon Eros, it was probably because in Socrates he had encountered a demonic man. How can we describe this dimension of the demonic? No one could be a better guide for us in this matter than Goethe, who was fascinated and troubled by the mystery of the demonic all throughout his life. His first encounter with the demonic had probably been Socrates' daimon, as depicted in Hammond's Socratic memorabilia. Socrates fascinated Goethe to such an extent that we find the following extraordinary exclamation in his letter to Herder of 1772: "If only I could be Alcibiades for one day and one night, then die." For Goethe, the demonic had all the ambiguous and ambivalent features of Socratic Eros. It is, as he writes in Book 20 of Poetry and Truth, a force which is neither divine nor human, neither diabolical nor angelic, which simultaneously unites and separates all beings, just as in the case of Eros in the Symposium. It can only be defined by simultaneous and contradictory negations, yet it is a force which gives its holders an incredible power over beings and things. The demonic represents a kind of natural magic within the dimension of the irrational and inexplicable. This irrational element is the motor force indispensable for all creation. It is the blind, inexorable dynamic which we cannot escape, but must rather learn how to use. In his Urwort, I'm probably misspelling that horribly, Goethe writes as follows about the daimon of individuals: "So must you be. You cannot escape yourself. No time nor power may destroy form marked with a seal, which develops as it lives." In Goethe, the creatures who most faithfully represent this demonic element take on the features of Eros in the Symposium. As Rob has demonstrated, this is particularly true in the case of Mignon. Mignon, like Eros, is indigent, but she aspires to purity and beauty. Although her clothing is poor and coarse, her musical gifts reveal her inner riches. Like Eros, she sleeps on the bare ground or on Wilhelm Meister's doorstep. Finally, like Eros, she is the projection and incarnation of Wilhelm Meister's nostalgia for a higher form of life. Another demonic figure in Goethe is Otilia, heroine of the elective affinities. She is depicted as a natural force, powerful, strange, and fascinating. Her profound relationship to Eros is more discreetly indicated than in the case of Mignon, but it is no less real. Mention should also be made of the hermaphroditic figure of Homunculus, whose relationship to Eros is emphasized so clearly in Act 2 of the Second Faust. As an ambiguous, ambivalent, indecisive element, the demonic is neither good nor evil. Only mankind's moral decision can give it its definitive value. And yet this irrational, inexplicable element is inseparable from existence. The encounter with the demonic and the dangerous game with Eros cannot be avoided. Yeah, wow. That ends on page 165, middle page. Yeah, that's I think that is just some insightful thinking there. It really resonates a lot with me, and I'm not saying that I take it as true because it resonates with me, but I think he makes some very good points, and the references are very interesting, and I think he knows Goethe a lot better than I do, so I have to kind of defer to the man, but I think mortal man gives his best when he loves. There is, I've been playing around with another philosopher friend of mine, and sometimes I recently came across some stuff on the internet, talking about that, about how lossless compression is really the key to intellect. And, that comes from the technical side of my work, what I do for a living. And so I thought that was an interesting concept that kind of bridged into consciousness and AI. And then, this guy said, well, isn't it, it's agape love that is the actual algorithm that allows that lossless compression in his thinking all the way back to the monad, like Leibniz's monads. So, all the monads are copies of the one, and then there's the second one, which describes in the chat, and Hadot describes how Adam's sin was that he desired to act like the divine, with the divine freedom, without understanding what it was, and he acted a part that he had not earned or understood in some way. I mean, his point being that in that myth there are some embedded, there is some context in the context of when it was written to understand that, the meaning. He talks about that. Hadot talks about that there's kinds of paintings that seem very disjointed in the way that different elements are put on the canvas. But if you step back and you look at it from another angle, the landscape is actually, there's a hidden form in the landscape, and those things actually are part of the bigger picture, but you cannot see it in the thing itself. You have to see it in the context of the bigger landscape. And then that is, there is an implicit sometimes meaning. And I think that's that's a powerful example, I think, of just the way, this kind of corresponds with some studying I've been doing of Owen Barfield and his ideas on final and original participation, theories of the evolution of human consciousness, and how it relates to the way that we process and think and feel, and what's the role of myth. He was one of the inklings, so very interesting. I'm very I do try to practice some of these ancient techniques. I've tried to kind of work into my own personal life, kind of in my own way, and so I have kind of a mix of my own practices that I've written about and that I write, and the part of this discussion here, this post here, is actually part of me kind of just working through my own process with this material, and ultimately, these are all just words for the ineffable, and that's actually what Hadot goes on to say about Socrates, that he's speaking of, that the secret of life is an irrational thing, love, and that the source of this love, it has to be a self-love. And Nietzsche really resonated a lot with Socrates and was inspired by that, but he thought that Socrates suffered life and didn't really love it, and so he thought that made him a tragic man. But Hadot says that Nietzsche projected his own dream of a reconciliation between Apollo and Dionysus into this image of Socrates as a musician. In the dying Socrates, Nietzsche saw, I'm on page 168 in the middle, yet another reflection of his own drama. Socrates wanted to die. This is what was so shocking to Nietzsche. And at the moment of his death, he spoke these enigmatic words, O credo, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. It was as if he had been cured from some illness and owed a debt to the god of healing. And then he quotes Nietzsche, this ridiculous and terrible last word means for those who have ears, O credo, life is a disease. Is it possible that a man like him should have been a pessimist? He had merely kept a cheerful mien while concealing all his life long his ultimate judgment, his inmost feeling. Socrates suffered life, you tell me? And then he still revenged himself with this veiled, gruesome, pious, and blasphemous saying. I wish he had remained taciturn. Also, at the last moment of his life, in that case, he might have belonged to still a higher order of spirits. But Hadot says, his feeling is that Nietzsche hated what in Socrates, what he hated in himself. So he's projecting. And, this is another example of how we project our filters, and anthropomorphize these people and their writing. But I really think he goes on. Hadot at the end of the Figures of Socrates on 170 goes on to say, at the end of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche dedicates to Dionysus an extraordinary panegyric of the genius of the heart, which he repeats as evidence of his skill and psychological mastery in the Ecce Homo. Although this time he makes a point of refusing to say whom he is addressing. In this hymn, it is though we hear an echo of the Veni Sancti Spiritus, that old medieval encomium of the Holy Ghost, of which Hamann considered Socrates' diamond to be a prefiguration. I'm going to get this horribly bad, but it's Latin. Flecti quod est rigidum, fovi quod est frigidum, regi quod est devium. For Nietzsche, the genius of the heart has the same marvelously delicate power of softening, warming, and straightening. In his portrait of the spiritual guide with demonic powers, Nietzsche intends it to describe the action of Socrates, but as Bertram has suggested, wasn't he also thinking consciously or unconsciously of Socrates? We will conclude with Nietzsche's encomium, since it sums up admirably all the themes of our discussion in this chapter. The genius of the heart, as that great concealed one possesses it, the tempter God and born Pied Piper of consciousness, whose voice knows how to descend into the netherworld of every soul, who does not say a word or cast a glance, in which there lies no secret goal of seduction, the genius of the heart, who silences all that is loud and self-satisfied, teaching it to listen, who smooths rough souls and lets them taste a new desire, to lie still as a mirror, that the deep sky may mirror itself in them, the genius of the heart, from whose touch everyone walks away richer, not having received grace and surprised, not as blessed and oppressed by alien goods, but richer in himself, newer to himself than before, broken open and sounded out by a thawing wind, more uncertain perhaps, tenderer, more fragile, more broken, but full of hopes that as yet have no name.